What would you do if your neighbor decided your car was a threat to the entire community? It was a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where the air smelled crisp, birds chirped lazily, and the distant hum of sprinklers filled the suburban silence. Ethan Carter had just returned from dropping his kids off at school, his Tesla Model 3 gliding into the driveway without so much as a whisper. He loved this car, not just for its sleek design or smooth drive, but because it felt like a step toward the future. A cleaner, better future. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. As Ethan stepped out, a familiar presence caught his eye. Across the street, standing stiffly on her porch, was Karen. Arms crossed, lips pursed, that ever-present look of judgment carved into her face. She was watching him again. Staring. Ethan had grown used to her disapproving glances. She had made it clear from day one that she didn't like change, and Ethan, with his solar panels and electric car, represented everything she resented. Still, there was something different about her expression today. It wasn't just annoyance. It was sharper. More hostile. He gave her a polite nod, hoping to avoid another tedious conversation, but Karen had other plans. "You know," she called out, her voice dripping with contempt, "those electric cars are illegal. They're a hazard. You shouldn't be allowed to have that thing here." Ethan paused, blinking. Illegal? Hazard? His grip tightened on the car door as he turned to face her. "Karen, Teslas are completely legal," he said, keeping his voice calm. "They're actually safer for..." She cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Don't lecture me. I've read the articles. Those things catch fire. They explode. You're putting this whole neighborhood at risk." Ethan felt his patience thinning, but he forced himself to stay composed. "That's not true. Teslas go through rigorous safety testing." "Enough." Karen snapped, stepping forward, her face reddening. "You think you're better than everyone else with your fancy car and your so-called green lifestyle? Well, I won't stand for it. If you don't get rid of that car, I'll make sure you regret it." She turned on her heel and stormed inside, slamming the door so hard that a nearby wind chime rattled violently. Ethan stood frozen, the words lingering in the air like smoke. He had always known Karen was difficult, but this felt different. Not just petty complaints or passive-aggressive remarks, this was a direct threat. And the way she had said it, with that cold certainty in her eyes, sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. Shaking his head, he walked toward his front door, trying to push the encounter out of his mind. Maybe she was just having a bad day. Maybe she'd calm down by tomorrow. But as he stepped inside, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He had no way of knowing it yet, but that morning was just the beginning. Ethan did his best to brush off Karen's threat. Maybe she was just trying to intimidate him, blowing smoke as she always did. But the uneasy feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He found himself glancing toward her house more often than usual, watching for any signs of further hostility. For the rest of the day, things seemed normal, if he ignored the fact that Karen's curtains occasionally twitched, revealing a sliver of her watching him. He tried to focus on work, picking the kids up from school, and settling into his usual evening routine. Then, that night, something woke him. A sharp, deliberate thud echoed outside, jolting him upright in bed. His heart pounded as he strained to listen, but the night was silent. It wasn't the rustling of a stray cat or the clatter of a raccoon rummaging through a trash bin. This had been something else. Something deliberate. He got up and peered through the window, scanning the driveway. Nothing. His Tesla sat undisturbed beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. He exhaled, feeling ridiculous for being so paranoid, and went back to bed. The next morning, he understood why he had woken up. As he stepped outside, he immediately noticed something wrong. His Tesla's charging cable lay sprawled across the driveway, detached from the wall and twisted unnaturally. He walked over, picking it up, and his stomach dropped. The connector was scratched, the cable frayed in multiple places, like it had been cut or yanked violently. He stared at it in disbelief, then turned his gaze toward Karen's house. Her curtains were closed, but that didn't mean anything. His jaw tightened. Could it have been an accident? Maybe a stray animal had somehow gotten tangled in it. Maybe some neighborhood kid had been messing around. But deep down, he knew better. He debated knocking on Karen's door, confronting her directly, but what good would that do? She would deny it. She'd probably even twist the situation to make herself the victim. No, he needed proof. That afternoon, Ethan installed a security camera facing the driveway. It wasn't a high-end system, but it would do the job. If Karen, or anyone else, tried something again, he'd have evidence. He also decided to park his Tesla closer to the garage, keeping it within better view. For the next couple of days, things seemed quiet. Karen stayed out of sight, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought maybe he'd overreacted. Maybe she had just been all talk. Then, on Friday evening, as he pulled into the driveway after picking up groceries, a faint, acrid smell hit his nose. His stomach twisted as he stepped out of the car and followed the scent toward the front yard. His breath caught in his throat. Near the charging port, a small, charred patch of grass marred the otherwise perfect lawn. It wasn't large, just a blackened circle about the size of a dinner plate, but the implications were horrifying. Something had burned here. His pulse pounded as he knelt down to inspect the damage. At first glance, it looked like a simple scorch mark. But then he noticed something unusual. A small, melted piece of plastic sat at the center of the burn. He picked it up gingerly. It didn't belong to his car. His stomach churned. Had someone placed something flammable near his Tesla while it was charging? Had someone tried to start a fire? His first instinct was to call the fire department. Within minutes, they arrived, inspecting both the car and the burn site. Though they didn't find immediate signs of danger, one of the firefighters pulled him aside, his expression serious. "This isn't just some random incident," he said. "Looks like someone tampered with this area. I can't say for sure what caused it, but I'd recommend checking any security footage you might have." Ethan's mind raced. He thanked them, watching as they drove away, then turned toward Karen's house. Had she really gone this far? He marched across the street, fists clenched, and knocked on her door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door cracked open, and Karen peered out, her face blank. "Karen," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "did you do something to my car?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she slammed the door in his face. A cold fury settled over Ethan. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This wasn't just petty complaints or power plays through the HOA. This was intentional sabotage. And he wasn't going to let it slide. Ethan woke up the next morning with a sense of unease that refused to fade. Karen's silence, the burn mark near his car, the severed charging cable, it was all adding up to something far more malicious than just neighborhood pettiness. He had no doubt now that she was behind it, but without hard proof, what could he do? The police wouldn't take his word alone. Determined, he checked the footage from the security camera he had installed. His heart pounded as he fast-forwarded through the night's recording. The screen flickered with the quiet, empty view of his driveway, until something changed. A shadow moved. He paused, rewound, and hit play again. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking the figure sneaking toward his car in the dead of night. They crouched near the Tesla, lingering for a moment before quickly retreating. The burn spot was left behind. Ethan clenched his fists. He had her. Just as he was about to save the footage, he noticed something else, another flicker in the recording. He squinted at the screen, confusion replacing his anger. The camera had captured motion, but then, suddenly, the video skipped ahead several minutes as if it had been tampered with. He played it again, heart sinking. Someone had disabled his camera, wiped part of the footage, and then restarted it, just enough so that he couldn't get a clear look at the person's face. Karen was getting smarter. Frustration boiled in his chest. He had almost caught her. Almost. He needed something stronger, something undeniable. And then, as if on cue, Karen escalated things even further. The next morning, as Ethan grabbed the mail, he noticed a brightly colored envelope tucked among the usual bills and flyers. The words *** important community notice *** were stamped across the front. He tore it open, unfolding the paper inside. His jaw tightened. It was a printed letter, sent to every resident in the neighborhood, warning them about the so-called dangers of electric cars. The letter read like something out of a conspiracy forum. Did you know electric cars emit harmful radiation? Studies show prolonged exposure can cause long-term health issues, especially in children. They've been known to explode without warning. One nearly went up in flames just last night. We need to protect our community before disaster strikes. Join us in taking action against hazardous, unregulated vehicles. Though the letter was unsigned, Ethan didn't need a signature to know exactly who was behind it. His hands shook as he folded the letter back up. Karen wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against him. And she wasn't done. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Johnson from across the street approached him with a worried expression. "Ethan," she said hesitantly, lowering her voice, "I don't know if you've heard, but Karen's going door to door with a petition." "A petition?" Ethan frowned. Mrs. Johnson nodded. "She's trying to get the HOA to force you to move. She's claiming you're endangering the community with your car. She even told me you've been staging these incidents for attention." Ethan felt his blood turn to ice. He should have expected this. Karen wasn't just trying to make his life difficult, she was trying to drive him out altogether. "Did you sign it?" he asked, his voice tight. "Of course not," she said quickly. "But some people might. You know how she is. She makes people afraid of rocking the boat." Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. This was a full-on campaign against him. And then came the breaking point. That night, he was in the kitchen washing dishes when he heard a loud bang from outside. His stomach clenched. He sprinted to the window. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then he saw it. A flicker of light near the garage. His breath caught. Fire. He bolted for the front door, adrenaline surging through his veins. Flames licked up the side of his Tesla, crawling toward the garage. The acrid stench of burning plastic filled the air. Without thinking, he grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hallway and sprinted toward the car. The heat seared his skin, but he didn't stop. He aimed the nozzle, spraying the foam in controlled bursts, fighting to keep the fire from spreading. His hands trembled, but he kept going, desperate to save his car, his home, his family. By the time the fire department arrived, the worst of it was over. His Tesla was badly scorched, the paint bubbled and blistered, the side panels warped from the heat, but it hadn't exploded like Karen had so confidently warned everyone it would. The firefighters inspected the area, searching for the source of the flames. It didn't take long for them to find it. A pile of charred rags. A melted plastic container. The unmistakable smell of gasoline ****. It was arson. The lead firefighter turned to Ethan, his expression grim. This wasn't an accident. Ethan already knew that. His hands clenched into fists as he turned toward Karen's house. This time, he wasn't just suspicious. He wasn't just frustrated. This time, he had no doubt. Karen had tried to burn his car, right in his own driveway. And now, he was going to prove it. Ethan stood in his driveway, the charred remains of the fire still smoldering in his mind, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His Tesla, once sleek and pristine, was now scarred and blackened, a testament to just how far Karen was willing to go. But what filled him with more rage than the damage itself was the sheer audacity of it all. She had crossed every line: sabotage, harassment, manipulation, and now arson. There was no mistaking it. No denying it. And this time, he had proof. His security camera had caught everything. After the fire department left, Ethan immediately pulled up the footage. He scrubbed through the timeline, his heart pounding as the night's events played back on his screen. Then, there she was. Karen. Dressed in dark clothing, her posture hunched as she snuck into his driveway, carrying a plastic container and a bundle of rags. She moved with eerie precision, her hands working quickly as she poured liquid around the Tesla's charging port and onto the grass. Then, the moment that made Ethan's blood boil, she struck a match. For a few agonizing seconds, she watched the flames flicker to life, then darted back toward her house, her face briefly illuminated by the fire she had just set. Ethan's jaw tightened. This was it. He immediately called the police. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. This wasn't a petty argument or an exaggerated complaint to the HOA, this was a crime. Within 20 minutes, flashing red and blue lights lit up the quiet suburban street, their reflections dancing against the charred remains of his car. Officers stepped out, speaking in hushed tones with the fire department as Ethan handed them the footage. One officer, his face hard with disbelief, watched the video in silence before nodding stiffly. "This is more than enough," he said. And then they headed straight for Karen's house. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, watching as they knocked on her door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the porch light flicked on, and the door creaked open. Karen appeared, her face twisted into an expression of forced innocence, eyes darting between the officers and Ethan. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sickly sweet. "Karen Peterson?" The officer's tone was clipped, professional. "We need to speak with you regarding an incident of arson reported at your neighbor's residence." Karen blinked. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes narrowing before flickering toward Ethan. She knew. And for the first time, Ethan saw something in her face that wasn't arrogance. It was fear. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "We have video evidence," the officer continued, unfazed by her denial. "Would you like to come down to the station voluntarily, or do we need to proceed with an arrest?" Karen's bravado cracked. Her face drained of color. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding," she stammered. I was just trying to prove a point. Those cars are dangerous, you don't understand." But the officers weren't listening. They had heard enough. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Karen let out a shrill gasp as one of the officers grabbed her wrist, turning her around. The click of handcuffs was sharp, final. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "I was protecting the neighborhood. He's the problem. That car is the real threat." Ethan just watched. No words. No satisfaction. Just the quiet weight of justice finally settling into place. As they led her to the squad car, neighbors peeked through windows, some stepping onto their porches in hushed disbelief. Karen, the self-appointed watchdog of the neighborhood, the queen of the HOA, was now being shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal. And yet, even as they shut the door, she still had the nerve to glare at Ethan, her expression contorted with rage and desperation. "This isn't over," she hissed through the glass. Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart still racing. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe she'd fight this, twist the story, try to weasel her way out. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care. Because for now, she was gone. And the neighborhood? It had never felt so quiet. The days following Karen's arrest felt surreal. The once tense atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted, replaced by an odd sense of relief. People who had once kept their heads down now stopped by to check in on Ethan, offering quiet words of support. Some neighbors even admitted they had their own run-ins with Karen over the years but had been too intimidated to push back. It turned out he wasn't the only one she had tried to control, just the only one who had finally stood up to her. But the aftermath wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. The damage had been done. Ethan's Tesla, though still reparable, was a reminder of how far fear and ignorance could drive a person. His kids were shaken, struggling to understand why someone would try to hurt them over something as simple as a car. And then, just as he started to move forward, he got a call from the police station. Karen had been released on bail. That afternoon, he spotted her standing in her driveway, her usual air of superiority completely gone. She looked smaller, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. For a long moment, she simply stared at her house, like she wasn't sure she belonged there anymore. Ethan should have felt victorious, but instead, all he felt was exhaustion. When he finally approached her, she didn't meet his eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she whispered. "I was just scared." Scared of what? Change? Losing control? The future? She didn't elaborate, and maybe she didn't even know the answer herself. But in that moment, Ethan realized something. Karen wasn't a monster. She was a person who had let fear dictate her actions, until it consumed her completely. She tried to make amends in the weeks that followed, apologizing to neighbors, offering to help with small tasks, even attending an environmental education group in an effort to understand the very thing she had once fought so hard against. Not everyone forgave her, and Ethan wasn't sure if he ever fully would either, but he had seen something shift in her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Karen walked up to him, a small potted plant in her hands, a peace lily. "It's supposed to symbolize new beginnings," she said quietly. He took it, nodding. "Thanks, Karen." As she turned to leave, Ethan watched the sunset over the quiet street, his home no longer feeling like a battlefield. Karen's actions had nearly torn the neighborhood apart, but in the end, they had also brought people together. Fear and ignorance had driven this war. But understanding? Maybe that's what would finally end it. What do you think? Can someone like Karen truly change? Or do people like that always find their way back to chaos? Share your thoughts below.